Section 3.2, the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are the main summary of Buddhist teachings. They were what the Buddha taught in his first sutra or sermon given to the five hermits, which you can see in this picture. The Four Noble Truths are suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation or end of suffering, and the path to the end of suffering. So Buddhism is focused on this problem of human suffering and how to end it. And according to the Buddha, if you understand suffering, if you understand its cause, that the suffering can come to an end, and how to bring about the end of suffering, then basically you will solve the main problem of life or existence. So that's the main focus of the religion. So the Buddha sometimes says that there are questions that he will not answer. These are called the 10 unanswered questions in Buddhism. They relate to philosophical questions or questions about the nature of reality. So they correspond to what's called metaphysics in philosophy, theories about the basic nature of things. Examples of questions that the Buddha would not answer. Is the world eternal or not? Is the world infinite or not? Is a sentient being, that is a conscious being, the same as their body or different? And then there are questions about a Tathagata. That's a being who's gone over there, i.e. a being who has completely escaped samsara. Do they exist after the death of their last body or not, or both, or neither? So the Buddha refuses to answer these questions, and he says, he compares demanding an answer to these questions as someone who's been shot with a poisoned arrow, and before they receive treatment from a doctor, they insist to know answers to a lot of questions they have about who shot them, what the caste of the person who shot them was, what type of arrow they used, and so on. And so the Buddha says the person who was shot with the arrow would die in pain before they got their questions answered. So there's a couple things going on in this parable. It's comparing Buddhism to a type of medicine, and this is a metaphor used by a lot of Buddhists, that the Buddha was like a physician or doctor who can not necessarily cure your physical illness, but can cure your spiritual illness or your mental illness, which is this problem of suffering. But also it shows a kind of practical orientation of Buddhism, and that the teaching of the Buddha, his Dharma, focuses on the problem of how to end suffering, but it doesn't necessarily answer all philosophical or spiritual questions you might have. The first noble truth is dukkha, which means suffering. The literal meaning of dukkha in Sanskrit is pain or anguish. Examples of dukkha that the Buddha often points to are being born, getting old, getting sick, and dying. Birth itself can be suffering because it tends to throw you into a world of experience, including pain and other things that are difficult to deal with. Other examples of suffering include emotional states like sorrow, grief, pain, or unhappiness. The four sights that the Buddha saw before he decided to become a Shramana include examples of suffering, the main three being old age, sickness, and death. However, the deeper definition of suffering that the Buddha gives is not just sickness, old age, and death. It's an inner state of mind, which he calls clinging to the five aggregates. So in other words, according to the Buddha, you don't have to suffer even if you do get sick, get old, and die. The suffering is actually not those external events, strictly speaking, but your mind's reaction to them. So suffering is clinging, which is a type of psychological state. And the word clinging kind of implies a kind of tightness and tenseness and discomfort around your experience. The five aggregates or heaps are a way of referring to different types of experience. Form, the first one, this is the Sanskrit word rupa, R-U-P-A, refers to both physical objects and our sensory perceptions of them through sight, sound, and the other senses. So the idea is that these physical objects are not themselves suffering, but our clinging to them is the suffering. Feeling refers to a pleasant, painful, or a neutral feeling. So the idea is that psychologically, when we perceive certain objects or sense perceptions, this can also generate pleasant or painful or neutral feelings in us. Once again, it's not the pain itself that is the suffering, but it's rather our clinging to that pain or to that pleasure. So a pleasant feeling can itself be suffering according to Buddhism if you have clinging to the pleasure. The third aggregate is called perception, and this actually refers to what you might call thoughts, mental labels that you categorize your actual sense experiences with. So for example, if you're looking at a desk and you apply the label of desk or the thought, this is a desk, to what you're seeing, that would count as a perception in this sense. The fourth aggregate is formation, and this is where karma comes into play. Formation is a translation of the word sankhara, and it's a reference to a type of shaping that you do in your mind. So this includes emotions and intentions and other sorts of mental actions. So it's really here that is the origin of suffering, because this is where clinging can come up. It is itself one of the aggregates, though, because you can also have clinging to your formations themselves. The fifth aggregate is called consciousness, and this means your awareness of the other aggregates. In the picture on the right, you can see the five aggregates in a Buddhist manuscript symbolized as five thieves. The idea is that they can rob you, they can beat you up, they can mug you, but it's really you yourself are causing the problem by clinging to the aggregates. But the idea is these aspects of our experience can be sources of danger because of how our mind responds to them. At the bottom of the picture is a dancer on the lower right. This is someone who's freed from clinging. So the metaphor is when you stop clinging to the aggregates, you can move freely and with skill and agility like a dancer. The person on the lower left is someone who is still clinging to the aggregates, so they're swept up in the flooding river of samsara. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering. So according to the Buddha, the cause of suffering is something called trishna, which is a Sanskrit word that literally means thirst. It can also be translated as craving. It's sometimes translated as desire. This can be misleading because the English word desire has a very broad sense. It can refer to any type of willing or intending or any type of motivation for action. And as we'll see, there are types of desiring that are considered okay or good by the Buddha. But the types that are problematic are the types that involve a type of excessive or unskillful craving that leads to clinging. So basically the desires that would be okay are ones that don't involve clinging, like, for example, a desire for your authentic well-being or for the authentic well-being of others. But the desires that involve clinging, or that cause clinging rather, those are the ones that count as craving. So there are three kinds of craving, and you'll notice the Buddha and Buddhism generally is really fond of these numbered lists. They include numbered lists of different states of mind, skillful and unskillful actions, etc. Because of this systematic, ordered nature, Buddhism is sometimes compared to a philosophy or a science. To a certain extent, you might say it's a semantic issue, whether it counts as a philosophy or as a religion. But in addition to the clear aspects of the Four Noble Truths that count as a kind of ancient philosophical theory of the mind or in ancient psychology, there are clear religious elements of Buddhism as well, such as belief in supernatural beings and powers, and also the fact that you're supposed to perform rituals honoring the Buddha and other beings. So the three kinds of craving are for sense desires, being and becoming, and non-being. The first kind is the most intuitive. So this would be craving to have a particular type of sensory experience, such as a literal thirst that would be craving for water. The second type of craving is more subtle. Being and becoming is a translation of the Sanskrit word bhava, B-H-A-V-A. This means a state of being. So this type of craving is not necessarily craving for a particular sense experience, but for rather a general state of being. Like if you want to be famous, for example, or if you want to be enlightened or in heaven or wealthy, all of those would be craving for states of being. And then the third type is for a state of non-being or non-becoming. So for example, if you want to be free from suffering, if you don't want to be a liar, if you don't want to be poor, those could be sources of craving. Now you'll notice in some of the things I listed, they included craving for things that actually are good, like craving for nirvana, for example. But in Buddhism, the idea is it is good to desire or will or intend for nirvana or intend to produce happiness for yourself and other beings, and yet you can still approach that in a wrong way. So if you have craving for your own happiness or the happiness of others, paradoxically, it's a self-destructive path that could end or actually diminish the happiness of yourself or others. So there's basically a way of approaching the Buddha's Dharma that is itself skillful. The Buddha calls this practicing the Dharma in accordance with the Dharma. Whereas if you practice the Dharma in an unskillful way, that could involve these problematic types of craving. And the idea here, this is a kind of psychological claim that Buddha is making with the second noble truth. He's saying that craving is a psychological state that is the cause of this clinging. So clinging itself is the suffering, so craving would be the cause of the suffering. Also associated with craving are three defilements. Defilement is an English translation of the word klesha. Klesha is a Sanskrit word that can mean something like tainted or poisoned. So this is a metaphorical way of referring to states of mind that are like poisons. And the three defilements are greed, aversion, and delusion. So basically you can think of these as three ways that craving manifests. And you'll notice these don't necessarily correspond to any type of desire, but three specific types of desiring. The first one, greed, is the most obvious type of craving. It's where you want something to be experienced by you, or you want to have a certain state of being. So it's more of a positive type of craving. So greed for wealth or greed for sex. In Buddhist iconography, it's often symbolized by a bird or a rooster. The second defilement is aversion, which could also be translated as hatred, but aversion is a bit more clear because this is talking about craving to not have a certain experience or to not have a certain state of being. So if you have an aversion to seeing someone or an aversion to pain, that would actually be a type of craving. The aversion is symbolized by the snake. And then the third type of craving is called delusion or ignorance, and this is symbolized by a pig or a boar. What's interesting is that delusion or ignorance is thought of as not just a lack of knowledge. There could be that type of ignorance as well, but the one that is a craving or a defilement is where your mind is actually performing a type of action. So Buddhism thinks that many forms of ignorance are actually something you're deliberately choosing. You could imagine a case where someone is in denial about something. I think that's a nice way of illustrating the concept of delusion. And they're actively putting forth mental energy to not confront some fact. So according to the Buddha, the reason why beings are suffering is in part because they're in denial about the way their own mind works. So For example, if you just blame other beings for your suffering, or if you blame external phenomena, that's not the full story. There's a sense in which you are producing the suffering in your own mind through your craving and clinging. So that's kind of the Buddha's solution to this problem too, is if you just abandon craving and clinging, you can end the suffering. So that leads us to the third noble truth, which is the cessation or end of suffering. Cessation or end is a translation of the Sanskrit word nirodha. And this is basically referring to a state of being or a state of mind in which you're no longer experiencing suffering or its cause. The third noble truth is not just that it's possible to have cessation, but that the only way to have it is by abandoning craving. So the idea is you cannot have your cake and eat it too. If you want to end suffering, you have to end craving. There is no other way. So Nirodha is similar to the concept of nirvana, which you've probably heard of before. The difference is that Nirodha can be used to refer to a temporary cessation of suffering brought about by the temporary abandonment of craving. So in particular, this is something you can achieve in meditation, according to Buddhism, where you experience a focused, calm state of mind called Dianna. And this is something you can experience temporarily before you abandon permanently the cause of suffering in your mind. Nirvana means extinction, and this is a reference to the permanent end of suffering. And according to the Buddha, the way you can do this is by permanently abandoning or casting out the defilements from your mind. So after nirvana, your consciousness continues, but it's regarded as free of any limiting factor. So it has a type of freedom similar to the concept of moksha or liberation in Hinduism. In fact, the term moksha is sometimes used in Buddhism as well to refer to nirvana, but nirvana is more common. So the word nirvana, because it literally means extinction, is sometimes misinterpreted as just the extinction of awareness. But actually it's referring to the continuity of awareness, just without craving and without suffering. There's also a metaphorical aspect of the Buddha's use of the word nirvana, which is worth reflecting upon. The literal meaning of the ancient Sanskrit word nirvana is unbinding, or not binding. And this is probably a reference to the idea that you're not clinging anymore. So it's like part of your mind is releasing its grip, unbinding from the things it used to cling to. But there's also another metaphor going on here, which is involving fire. And the Buddha also uses fire as a symbol for suffering and for craving in some of his sutras. So in ancient India, there was a belief that fire was sustained by clinging to its fuel. There was a lot of theorizing about fire in ancient India, in large part because of the importance of fire in the rituals of the Veda. Even though the Buddha did not accept the Veda or Hinduism, he was definitely influenced by that culture. That's probably one of the reasons why fire metaphors occur a lot in his teachings, because fire was something that the Brahmins, the priests, talked a lot about in ancient India because of the importance of the fire sacrifice and also the god Agni, god of fire. But the belief was that fire that you kindle is clinging to its fuel, and the fuel is allowing the fire to manifest, but it's also limiting the fire because the fire cannot just fly free away from the wood or other fuel. And there is a notion that when you extinguish a fire, the fire is actually not permanently destroyed. It's still out there somewhere, at least in potential or unmanifest form. And that's why you can rekindle a fire either from the same fuel source or from a similar fuel source. So the Buddha is kind of leveraging this terminology, these concepts, in explaining the idea of nirvana. So just as fire clings to the fuel when it's burning, your mind can cling to the objects of your craving. And so your mind will actually not be permanently extinguished or snuffed out when you end that craving. Instead, it's going to be actually freer, even though it won't be manifest in the same way. So after a completely awakened being has their last incarnation, they're not going to return to samsara, but this is actually a state of freedom because they're no longer stuck on one body, which would be analogous to fire stuck on one fuel source. The fourth noble truth is the path to the end of suffering. This is called the Noble Eightfold Path because it has 8 parts or steps. Now, one thing to consider regarding the 4 noble truths is that the Buddha calls them noble or Aryan truths, and his use of the word Aryan here, it's the same word as was used to describe the ancient Indian ethnic group who settled in India around 1500 BC and whose text, the Veda, became the source of Hinduism. But he's not using the word to refer to the ethnic group. He's using it to refer to its literal meaning, which is something like noble. So these truths are noble because they lead to the noble goal of nirvana. But the path to the end of suffering is regarded as something you have to develop over time. So on the one hand, you technically have the complete freedom to just let go of craving at any time. So the belief in that the Buddha teaches in karma involves free will. He even attacks teachers who don't have a view of free will. But on the other hand, even though in theory you have the freedom to end your suffering at any time, in practice there's kind of a sense that you have to gradually train yourself so that your mind doesn't work in these ways. So it's like your mind has these ruts or patterns or habits that it's in, and so there's a path of practice you have to follow in order to undo that. The 3 main parts of the path are wisdom, morality or discipline, and concentration or meditation. And we'll go through each of these 3 main parts of the path and the 8 specific steps in more detail. So first comes wisdom or prajna. So wisdom includes right view and right thought. Right view basically includes the 4 noble truths, but there's an idea in Buddhism that you cannot just understand the 4 noble truths intellectually and expect to be awakened or enlightened. Instead, you have to actually apply them to your experience moment to moment. So viewing your experience in terms of the 4 noble truths, which is right view, means being able to see suffering in your mind, being able to see the cause of suffering in your mind, and being able to see how when you abandon the cause, you abandon the suffering. And also this would include the ability to apply the Eightfold Path itself, given what's actually happening in your mind moment to moment. The second part of the Noble Eightfold Path is called right thought. Basically, this is including thought in a broad sense, not just thoughts in terms of statements about the world, like the sky is blue or the earth is round, but thoughts here can include intentions. So another translation for the term here would be right intention. And this is where desire comes into the path, the Buddhist path, because these thoughts can include what we would call desires. Desire for the good, the happiness or well-being of yourself and others. That's called goodwill, which you can see on this slide is written as metta. Metta is actually the Pali spelling of the word, the Pali pronunciation. Pali is closer to the language spoken by the Buddha during his lifetime. I'm using it on this slide because it's the more commonly known way of writing or pronouncing goodwill in Buddhism. However, most of the time I'm actually using the Sanskrit pronunciations and spellings of words. The reason for this is that even though the Pali is closer to what the Buddha himself used, and it's the oldest complete set of Buddhist scriptures uses Pali, the Pali canon, many Buddhists use Sanskrit as well. Somewhat ironically, a lot of later Buddhist texts were written in Sanskrit because Sanskrit had become the standard language of religion and scholarship in India. But to avoid confusion, I'll usually just stick with the Sanskrit and not the Pali. Goodwill is an exception because metta and metta meditation are very popular in today's culture. But goodwill is a type of desire. It is desiring your own authentic long-term happiness and that of others. So the idea is this is something you want to deliberately cultivate. You are cultivating desires for your own and others' happiness. That's goodwill. A thought of nonviolence basically means not harming others. This is a translation of ahimsa, not harming. And the idea is you want to have thoughts of not harming others. And this is a right way of thinking or a right way of intending or desiring. The third type of right thought is renunciation. And this is the opposite of greed. So this is deliberately cultivating thoughts of not needing a lot or doing without. And the idea is this is not just supposed to be a negative process. The Buddha talks about delight in abandoning. That's one of the factors of being successful in the path. The other is delight in developing. So delight in developing in this context of right thought could include you're actually happy when you can develop thoughts of goodwill. Delight in abandoning would include being happy from being able to give things up. So the general idea here, though, is that you can't just go with the flow. It's worth contemplating that for a second, because a lot of people, when they think about Buddhism, I think they have a kind of mistaken idea that Buddhism is all about just letting go. There might be aspects of it which are about letting go. So that's letting go of clinging, for example. But there's other aspects of the religion that are very kind of like disciplined and focused. So you can actually see that in right thought itself, the second step of the Noble Eightfold Path, because you are not going to be able to have right thought just by letting the usual flow of your mind continue. You have to be more like a gardener who's uprooting weeds and eliminating pests. You're taking an active role in tending to the garden of your mind, so to speak. The second section of the Noble Eightfold Path is morality, or sila. Another translation of the word sila is discipline, and you'll notice these include things you're not supposed to do for the most part. So they're kind of like restraints or discipline. The third step of the Noble Eightfold Path is right speech. So this includes not saying things that are false, but it also includes more subtle forms of right speech. Refraining from divisive speech means not saying things that are likely to turn other people against each other. Refraining from abusive speech means not being overly harsh, critical, or abusive in how you talk to people. It doesn't mean you should never criticize people, but it does mean you should do it in as friendly or well-intentioned and well-mannered a way as possible. And then the fourth one is refraining from idle chatter. This would include talking about things that really aren't important. It could be about anything that's not really related to the big problem of suffering and how to end it. So perhaps talking about politics, sports, movies, video games. It would really depend on the context. I mean, you can imagine cases where all four of those things I just mentioned might count as relevant to ending suffering. But the idea is if you're engaging in talk that's not really about the path, then you should refrain from that. The fourth step of the Noble Eightfold Path is right action. So this includes not harming living beings. This would include all types of sentient beings, all beings that have karma and that are part of samsara. So this would include animals like an elephant or a tiger. It would include other, spiritual beings like ghosts, demons, gods. All of those beings are regarded as part of samsara in Buddhism. You should not harm any of them. But it would not include plants or other types of things that might technically be alive, but that are not part of samsara. So if they have karma, if they have some type of conscious awareness, then they are part of samsara. They are sentient beings. If not, they're outside of samsara. The second type of right action is not stealing. So this is often expressed as don't take something unless it's been given or offered to you. The third type of right action is not having sex at all if you're a monk or a nun, or if you're a Buddhist layperson, This means not engaging in a sexual relationship unless you basically have been given permission or have the proper standing. The details of unpacking this are a little bit tricky, but the basic idea is you should not have sex outside of a marriage or a committed relationship, or you should not have sex with someone that their family has not given them permission to marry, or they're not of an age where they can consent to marriage. So there's a lot of little ins and outs there, but that's the basic idea. It's putting constraints on lust, because a lust or sexual desire, like in Hinduism and Buddhism, it's thought of as one of the most intense forms of craving, and so it can be problematic if it's not kind of tamed or controlled. The fifth step of the Noble Eightfold Path is called right livelihood. This means to how you conduct yourself in general, so it can include right lifestyle, but it can also include how you earn a living. And basically, for monks, this is very strict. You are not supposed to earn a living at all. You're not supposed to have like a side job or something like that, a side gig. If you're a monk, you're only supposed to subsist on the offerings of lay people, what they freely give to you. There is supposed to be reciprocity here. You're supposed to give them something in return, which is teaching them about the Dharma, or serving as an inspiring example to them, even giving them blessings or prayers. So that's the give and take, the quid pro quo for monks. Lay people, though, are also restrained in how they're supposed to earn a living. So you're not supposed to be an arms dealer. You're not supposed to sell slaves. You're not supposed to sell animals to be killed, or the flesh of animals that have been killed. You're not supposed to sell alcohol or other intoxicants. So what these have in common is that basically you're not supposed to earn a living in a way that conflicts with the other rules of morality or the other rules of conduct in Buddhism. So let's look a bit more at the idea of right action. So there's an alternate list of the forms of right action called the Five Precepts. These overlap with a couple of steps of the Noble Eightfold Path and include an additional rule as well. So the Five Precepts are binding for all Buddhists, both monks and lay people, although the monks have a stricter version of them, especially rule number 4. So the first precept is don't kill or harm any sentient being. The second precept is don't steal. The third is don't lie or make false statements. The fourth is to not engage in illicit sex. So for monks, this would be not any sex at all. Monks are not even supposed to touch people of the opposite sex. For lay people, this basically includes the types of restrictions I mentioned on the previous slide. And the fifth precept is to not consume intoxicants that cause heedlessness. That includes things like alcohol that kind of lower your inhibitions and your ability to be mindful and aware of your mind. So it would probably not include things like tea or coffee, since those are kind of mild stimulants, which, if anything, might make you a little bit more heedful or aware and cautious. Some Buddhist monks, for example, they will drink tea to even help them stay alert during meditation. But alcohol and other intoxicants that make you less aware, like morphine, for example, or heroin, or even things that might technically be stimulants, but that derange you and take you out of your right state of mind, like methamphetamine. All of these would be things you must avoid in Buddhism. In addition to these 5 precepts, the Buddha gave extensive advice for lay people. That was a more positive set of things that you should do. And you can see some of those things illustrated in the image on the right. So, for example, take care of your parents and family members. Avoid gambling, avoid going out at night and drinking and spending your money and things like that. The third and final part of the Noble Eightfold Path is concentration. This is a translation of the Sanskrit word samadhi. In Buddhism, samadhi means meditation practice in general. It can also mean a highly focused state of mind that you attain through meditation practice. So this includes the last 3 steps of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right effort, step 6, involves effort to change what's in your mind. So it connects to that idea I mentioned earlier that Buddhism is not advocating just going with the flow of your mind. It's advocating being more proactive. So there's a distinction here between unwholesome and wholesome states. Unwholesome is a translation of the Sanskrit word akusala. Wholesome is a translation of the Sanskrit word kusala, Kusala. Kusala can mean beneficial, but it can also mean skillful. So there's a sense in which there are certain sorts of states of mind that are more skillful. They're something that a wise person would choose, someone who has the skill of living well. And the idea here is that there's 4 types of effort you can engage in around these states of mind. The unwholesome ones, you want to be proactive and prevent them from arising if they have not yet arisen. So for example, suppose you are susceptible to road rage. So road rage would be an example of an unwholesome state for a Buddhist. In addition to being able to deal with it after it's already arisen, you want to strategize beforehand how to avoid provoking it. So maybe you will engage in like a little prayer or meditation before you go driving to try to get yourself in a clearer state of mind. Secondly, after an unwholesome state like anger or lust has arisen, you want to try to abandon it. So you don't just let it go its natural course, you try to confront it and figure out how to abandon and let it go. And yeah, this can be tricky, but that's why they use the metaphor of skill here, I think. And maybe it's not a metaphor, maybe it's just the way this works. It's like another skill. You have to kind of get used to playing with or responding to your own mind to figure out how to prevent and abandon these unwholesome states. And then with the wholesome ones, these would include states like goodwill or renunciation. You want to strategize how to get these to arise in your mind. You know, what sorts of things can you do now that might make it more likely that you'll have goodwill or compassion for someone else? And when they've already arisen, you don't just observe them and let them go. You try to figure out, okay, how can I develop these and make them stronger? So if you feel maybe like a teensy weensy bit of compassion for someone that before you just felt hatred for, maybe you could do something to help nourish and strengthen that compassion. So that's the idea of the right effort. It's like the path in Buddhism is something that you have to kind of work at. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. The 7th step of the Noble Eightfold Path is mindfulness. This means keeping in mind or remembering certain aspects of your experience. This is believed to serve as the basis for meditation, because if you keep something in mind for a long time, this can make your mind concentrated. So the first type of mindfulness is mindfulness of body. This can include awareness of the in and out breath. It can also include awareness of other types of bodily sensations. The second type of mindfulness is mindfulness of feeling. So this includes the painful, pleasant, and neutral feelings that we mentioned earlier. The third type of mindfulness is mindfulness of mind. This includes awareness of thoughts, perceptions, and more complex emotions. You may remember some of these from the list of the 5 aggregates. The fourth type of mindfulness is awareness of the moral and intellectual subjects. That term is a translation of the term Dhamma. Dhamma is the Pali spelling of Dharma. The word Dharma usually refers to the teaching of the Buddha, or the way the world works according to Buddhism. But it also has this other kind of technical meaning. It can mean any sort of true or real thing. It can be almost as broad as the English word thing or idea in some contexts. And that's how it's being used here. Moral and intellectual subjects is a way of referring to a Dhamma as a kind of idea or a thought construct. So how does this relate to mindfulness? Well, the idea is it can be helpful to keep in mind certain moral or intellectual themes, like being mindful of the 4 Noble Truths would fit into this category. Be mindful of intellectual subjects like the good qualities of the Buddha, or being mindful of the good qualities of other highly developed awakened beings like gods or saints. So the idea is deliberately reflecting on these things can actually be a type of mindfulness that serves as the basis for concentration. The eighth and last part of the Noble Eightfold Path is indeed concentration. This is the same word samadhi as what describes the last three factors of the path taken together. What this shows you is that right effort and right mindfulness are being thought of as basis for or supports for meditation. In order to get your mind into concentration, you have to practice some effort and you have to be mindful or keeping something in mind again and again, like the breath or something else going on in your body or mind. If you're able to stay on one topic of mindfulness, this can lead to what's called Dianna, or absorption in Buddhism. Dianna is a state of mind where your defilements temporarily go away. And it's also characterized by great calm, or shamatha, and insight, or vipassana. And the idea is if you develop the calm and insight enough, this will eventually lead to nirvana. The basic instructions in Buddhism for concentration or meditation practice are to find a relatively quiet or secluded place, like under a tree, in a cave, a room in a building, or even in a ruin, as you can see these monks doing here on the right. You sit cross-legged to have a stable posture, and then you direct your mind just to one theme of mindfulness, such as the breath. There are a distinction that many modern Buddhists make between mindfulness and concentration meditation, but in the original teaching of the Buddha in the Pali Canon and elsewhere, these seem to be parts of one practice. So mindfulness is keeping something like the breath in mind, and then if you do that enough, your mind becomes naturally concentrated on the breath. So when you practice concentration in this way, when you refine your concentration, it leads to Dianna, which literally means absorption. This is a state in which your mind is completely focused. It's one-pointed. All the parts of your mind are united, and they're all focused on the one theme, such as the breath. And during this state of absorption, your craving and your suffering temporarily cease. So in so doing, you can get insight into the cause of suffering and how to train your mind to let go of the cause of suffering. And eventually, this process of developing calm and insight will lead to bodhi, or awakening, which is basically the experience of nirvana, or the state of being in which you experience nirvana. Part of the Buddhist view of concentration practice is the four Diannas, or the four absorptions. These are states of mind that you can attain through meditation or concentration practice. On the one hand, Buddhism was similar to other ancient religions of India that started in the Middle Country as part of the Shramana movement around the 500s BC or so, because they all taught a meditation practice as something you had to do to attain salvation or enlightenment. So for example, the authors of the Upanishads also practiced and advocated meditation. However, Buddhism had this specific system of classifying the Diannas, or states of mind, you could attain through meditation. It was one of the distinctive aspects of Buddhism. The Buddha defines the four Diannas using 5 factors of concentration. The first Dianna has all 5 of them, and then as you get to higher Diannas, some of those factors actually drop away. So application of thought means that in the first Dianna, even though your mind is completely focused on the breath or another object, you have to continually apply the mind to that object. So there's still a little bit of deliberate effort or intention there. The second factor is called examining, or examining of qualities. And this means that you're sort of evaluating how the breath or another theme of concentration is doing. So you might notice, for example, if the breath is long or short. And you may also notice how the breathing is making the rest of your body feel. Joy and happiness are the third and fourth factors of concentration. So joy is a way of referring to a more bodily sensation that is pleasant or positive. This is sometimes also translated as rapture, and it can be felt throughout the whole body potentially. It can feel either somewhat intense, like a sort of rhythmic um, upwelling of relaxation or calm, or almost like a shuddering pleasure throughout the body, or it can be more subtle. But happiness is being used to refer to a more mental type of peace or pleasure, and the joy is something that's more physical. And then the fifth factor is one-pointedness, which means your mind is completely unified, both internally, so it's not like there's a bunch of random thoughts going off in different directions, and also as well as being unified in terms of the parts of the mind all working together. They all are focused on one object, which is going to be the breath or the other theme of your meditation. The second dhyana involves a more concentrated state of mind where you no longer have application of thought or examining. Your mind is just focused on the object without having to put any effort in, and you don't have to consciously evaluate it or examine it. With the third dhyana, you let go of the joy or the more physical aspect of pleasure, and you just have the more refined mental happiness left. The fourth dhyana is characterized only by one-pointedness of awareness, and you could also say there is equanimity or peace of mind or calm there as well. After the fourth dhyana, you can enter into what the Buddha calls the four formless meditations. So these are more abstract states of concentration. In boundless space, you have a sense of the infinity or limitlessness of physical space. In boundless consciousness, you have a sense of the lack of limits or the infinite nature of consciousness. In the sphere of nothingness, as it's called, you have awareness, but it lacks any specific object. So, for example, you're not even aware of space or of consciousness. You just have pure awareness. And then the fourth of the formless meditations is the most abstract. The Buddha calls that neither perception nor non-perception. So you have awareness, you are very aware of what's going on, but you're not even making the conscious judgment that you're aware. So it's this idea of the most refined state of consciousness possible. And the basic idea of these is that these are all states you can attain even while you're still in samsara. But by practicing meditation a lot and becoming a kind of master of these special states of mind, that will make you calmer, wiser, and thus help you attain nirvana eventually. So to give you a little bit more clarity about how meditation works, it's worth talking about the different types of things you can focus on in meditation. Focusing on the breath in the body is by far the most common theme, but there are many others mentioned in the Buddhist Pali Canon. This slide contains a list of 40 different subjects or themes that you can have while practicing meditation, derived by the later Buddhist scholar Buddhaghosa. He lived several centuries after the life of the Buddha, but he was basing this list upon things present in the Pali Canon. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but some examples are the kasinas. These are basically physical elements or colors or a given finite space that you can focus on. So it can be as arbitrary as something as focusing on the earth element. The Buddha talks about making your mind like earth when he's giving meditation instructions to his young son, Rahula. And the idea here is that earth has a kind of solidity to it, stability to it. And if someone throws garbage on the earth doesn't react. So it can basically be partially working here as a kind of symbol of what a solid and constant mind looks like. The 10 states of putrefaction are different states of decomposition of a human body after death. And this may seem kind of morbid or ghoulish, but the purpose of meditating on the states of putrefaction or decay is to diminish your sense of identification with the physical body, and also to get a level of acceptance and calm with just the reality of the fact of your own eventual demise. The 10 recollections are focusing on things that are kind of uplifting. So, for example, focusing on the Buddha or his Dharma, or on the order of monks, the Sangha, or on virtue or good conduct, or on generosity. You'll notice that the gods are also listed here. Devas or gods can be a part of Buddhism. Even though they're not the main object of worship, many of the gods are regarded as being examples of virtues like discipline or generosity or compassion. And so that's why they would enter into this list. You can basically look upon them as role models whose good qualities you might want to reflect upon. The divine abidings are also a very important theme of meditation. They're the most commonly chosen themes apart from the breath in Buddhism. Friendliness or goodwill means wishing the authentic happiness or well-being of all other beings in the world. Compassion means feeling empathy in response to their suffering. Sympathetic joy means feeling empathy in response to their joy or success. So you can think of it as the opposite of having envy towards people. When someone has something good happen to them or they're doing well, sympathetic joy means you can share in that joy. And then equanimity is peace of mind, which is not being overly attached to what happens to the world. What is interesting here is that equanimity is not the same as just not caring or being kind of cut off emotionally. All of these divine abidings or divine states of mind are supposed to be extensions of friendliness or goodwill. So the equanimity here is a peace of mind you have while still having goodwill to others. But if they are going to suffer or have some problem, and if it's something that you can't control, it doesn't help them or you to get overly upset by that. So you're able to both have goodwill to others but not suffer when they're in trouble. The analogy given to explain this is a mother who cannot control the decisions of her child. So the mother wishes her child well, but if the child is making decisions that are destructive, she still has goodwill and compassion for the child, but she doesn't let that sort of like make her miserable in a way that will help neither herself nor the child. The formless meditations are the same as the 4 extensions of the 4th Dianna from the previous slide, but you can actually use these as subjects of meditation in their own right. So you could take the theme of infinite space as the theme you're going to meditate on. The repulsiveness of food is basically a contemplation of what happens to food after you eat it. This is supposed to help diminish your attachment to eating and otherwise getting pleasure for the body. And then the reflection on the elements can include things like observing elements outside of yourself, but also observing elements inside yourself. So for example, noticing the solidity, which would be the earth property within your own body, or noticing warmth, which would be the fire property where it occurs in your own body.